Welcome to a Jew, a Muslim, and a Christian. My name is Father Mike Manning. I'm a Catholic priest.
And I'm Hillel Cohn, a rabbi.
And my name is Imad Bayoun, and I'm a Muslim.
The topic today is the place of women in our various religions. As a Christian, Jesus gave great respect to women. We find him, for example, waiting for Mary to make the decision of whether or not she would be the mother of the Messiah, as we understand. Through his life, there was contact with women in a very respectful and alive way. Mary Magdalene, who was the first person to hear the word of the resurrection of Jesus, which is so fundamental to us as Christians, it was to Mary Magdalene that he came. The place of women has always been very important. Paul, even in the early church, we find in the writings, especially at the end of his letters, references to women as integral parts of his evangelistic work. They were part of carrying out that message. But the situation has become rather difficult. The leadership in the church today is very much a male clerical religion. And there's a lot of tension that goes on with that. Our present Pope, Pope Francis, has spoken out about the need to give greater responsibility to women. He's held back with the idea of women being priests or even being deacons. But he has spoken of saying we need to open the doors. And the Second Vatican Council, which was a council of bishops that met back in the 60s, they opened the door to an awful lot of possibilities of women being more involved. They participate in our worship in the Eucharist. They participate in preaching in terms of being able to read the Gospels. So alive in that. And even in the administration of the church, there are certain roles that they play in the diocesan level. But there's still an awful lot needs to be done, and there's a real struggle with empowering women and making them feel that we should be doing more. There's even concern, as I shared with some of the women in my staff, saying that we're going to be talking about this, and they're saying, yeah, that's great for you three men to be talking about that, and it's true. But at the same time, I thought it was worth at least bringing that topic up. Could you share with us a little bit about what that topic means to you?
Well, of course, early Judaism was patriarchal. When we talk about the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, very little attention is given to the matriarchs, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. And that was, I think, consistent with the Middle Eastern culture of a few thousand years ago. And it's really only been in more recent times that, because of advances made in understanding of minorities and women sensing certain forms of oppression, that we have become much more conscious of limitations. One thing that was very troublesome to Jewish women was that the Orthodox liturgy calls upon people to recite blessings each and every day, and one of them is, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who has made me a man, not made me a woman."
Wow.
And women have had, obviously, some problems. People didn't ask that question for a long time, because I think women were geared to being put in their place by a male-dominated religious society and general society. And yet we can point to something, certainly in the Hebrew scriptures. The fact is that you have Deborah, the prophetess, maybe not enough people, but you have a Deborah, you have a Ruth, you have an Esther, people who are accorded a great deal of respect. The fact that a biblical book is named after them makes some difference. And I think in more modern times, perhaps the person I think of the most is Golda Meir, who became Prime Minister of the State of Israel. Well, the fact is that we still have a long way to go in according equality to women, because they have so much to contribute as individuals, as humans, and also as women. And we can talk a little bit later about the fact that we now have women who are serving as rabbis and cantors and so on. The church will come along one of these days.
You know, I think it's really important. I mean, also, I think something similar to what you said is that there's a difference between the teachings of the religion and the practice of the people. And if you look back actually at the Middle Eastern environment before Islam, that it was basically a male-dominant society. But you look afterward, actually, what the Prophet Muhammad actually preached. One of his famous saying is that the women are the siblings of the men. So they're in a way equal in the eyes of God. No one is better except the one who has more piety, as is clearly actually declared in the Quran. That's really the criterion, is really the piety. And it's really interesting. You said that the first person to follow the teachings of Jesus was a woman, Mary Magdalene, and with Muhammad, the first person to follow him was his wife Khadija, also a woman, interestingly. And the Prophet actually, interestingly, made a statement. He said that there were 4 women in history that attained perfection. One of them, of course, is Mary, the mother of Jesus, which in Islam we consider the greatest woman that ever lived.
Now that is really significant that you're saying that.
Now,
would you say that again?
Yes.
That's important.
Actually going even beyond that there's a chapter in the Quran called the chapter of Mary. And there's another chapter called the chapter of the Imrans, which are the parents of Mary. Which is the second largest chapter in the Quran, and there's also a chapter called the chapter of women. The important thing, and when I look at the teachings of Islam, talking from my perspective, I see perfect equality in the eyes of God, and no one is better, again, except when it comes to piety. But the fact is, I think the society sometimes default back into being a male-dominant society. So if I look back historically, before Prophet Muhammad, it was a male-dominant. After Prophet Muhammad, during his time and then afterward, women achieved a lot of rights and privileges, and they were able to attain that equality status. But I think through time, the culture probably pushed back in the other direction into going back. And I think this is something that the culture has to be blamed for and not the religion itself.
Can you see that there's perhaps in Islam, there might be some different trains of thought concerning women that you might find when we think of Saudi Arabia?
That's a good question.
We think of, ooh, and then yet maybe I can go to Indonesia and find a different
Sure, that's a good question. And I think, you have the religious text and you have the interpretation of the text. Yes. Now, the interpretation sometimes is subjective, and it's affected by the biases of the individuals. What I mentioned earlier as far as equality is concerned, that's really what the text preaches. But I think the interpretation of that is affected by the cultural baggage of the person. That's why you'll find, for example, the same text interpreted in one way in a certain environment, but slightly different in another environment. Yeah. And of course, the person who has the power is the one that's going to determine basically what it is. That's why I said at the time of the Prophet, basically because he has the power and his successors who followed his path has the power, so there was no room for enforcing a certain bias, so to speak. That's why equality was attained. But later on, of course, things change.
What's interesting is that women were given second-class status, and that men tried to come up, at least in Judaism, with all kinds of explanations or rationales. Well, women really do more important work, therefore they aren't obligated to observe the commandments that men are. I don't accept that.
Whoa.
I find that, to be condescending, yes. But that's at least the rationalization that people use to get out of it. The fact is that we have a long way to go to accord women in our society with equal pay. There is still a glass ceiling in terms of mobility, in terms of professions. Religiously, it's only really been the last 35 years that women have been ordained as rabbis in liberal Judaism, not in traditional or Orthodox Judaism.
What's the attitude of the more conservative towards a woman?
Conservative and Reform accept that, but it's still Orthodoxy is bound by what we call halakha, Jewish law, and therefore the law, really considered women as chattel. In the marriage contract, they're looked upon that way. We don't like to admit to all of that, but it's a reality, and I think we have to be honest with ourselves as to where our traditions have failed and where are they succeeding. We have a long way to go.
And we can run into the whole problem. I know that there can even be a tradition of an abusive situation in a family. Sure. Where saying, well, stay in that, the man might be beating her up all the time, and yet stay in that because that's God's will that you were married and whatnot. And we've got to really be careful that we don't do that. Well, listen, we've come to some good thoughts, but Let's please thank you for watching and stay tuned for this important program.